All right, Nehemiah. What's the story about Nehemiah? You know who Nehemiah is, right? Good on that? What did he do? And what does this have to do with being a servant? Give me a quick rundown on Nehemiah. What was his job? Remember? Tommy says he led a group of, rebuilt Jerusalem, led a group there in order to get all that redone. Yes. What was his secular job? He was cupbearer to the king. Do you know what the cupbearer would do? You know what the job description was? Well, that certainly would be one of them. Dirk said he might take a sip first to make sure what? That the king was not being poisoned by drinking that particular glass of whatever it was, grape juice or orange juice or kumquat juice or whatever they had in that particular part of the world. So certainly that was one of the things. Was he around the king on a regular basis? Being the cupbearer, the answer is yes, he was. So give me some more of the story. He went in to see the king, and what? He had a sad countenance. He was very sad. He didn't know. Apparently he was so upset that the king noticed that he was in a foul humor and wanted to know, Nehemiah, what's wrong?
And you were not supposed to have a sad countenance when you were with the king.
Joe points out that you're not supposed to have a sad countenance when you're in front of the king, and that's right, because what are you doing when you're in front of the king? You're at the feet of authority. Okay, you're under his discretion, his power. You know, you walk into the king's, oh, praise the king. Happy days. Oh, great king, live forever type of thing. And Nehemiah was not that way on this particular day. And the king says, well, what's wrong, Nehemiah? And then what did Nehemiah do? He said, well, I got some problems. I've heard about this remnant. I've heard about Jerusalem. Walls are falling down. Gates are in disrepair. I need to go see about it. I need to go check on it. I need to go fix it. What do you think that Artaxerxes knew about Jerusalem and Nehemiah? Anything in particular? Think he knew the importance of Jerusalem? I think I'm right on this. This Artaxerxes would have been the stepson of Esther. Okay? Double check that for me, because I found that when I was going through some things and I did not have time to completely vet it. Just put that back, do a little homework, see if I'm right on that. But regardless, what did Artaxerxes do for Nehemiah? He let him go. He gave him letters in order to be able to get to Jerusalem, to be able to get supplies, to be able to get all the things it was that he was going to do. And then what did Nehemiah do once he got there? Rebuilt that wall. Scripture says that they did it with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other in 52 days. Right? Now think about that. Rebuilt that wall, one-handed, in 52 days. My question is, who did Nehemiah serve? He served God, certainly. Who else did he serve? Pardon? Which people, Marie? His own people. Wasn't he serving the Israelites, the Jews? Who else did he serve? The king. What we're talking about tonight, as far as tonight's lesson goes, is serving one another and serving by involving others. Did Nehemiah do that? He served King Artaxerxes. He certainly served God when he went back to take on this task. And he served his fellow Israelites who were with him, serving both as a a work leader, a mentor, a project director, and a simple worker with a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other, as they rebuilt, or a plastering trowel or some other implement in one hand and a sword in the other. He served everybody he could serve in that particular instance, which we've named was at least 3, right? Now, why am I bringing up Nehemiah regarding this? Turn to Matthew chapter 20, verse 28. Whoops, I got to find my scriptures. Hang on. Here we go. Matthew chapter 20, verse 28. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give His life as a ransom for many. We'll probably have Matthew 20, 28 in every single Wednesday night class during the quarter, because it's the bottom line to everything about serving, right? The word serve in Matthew 20, 28 is diakono, which means caregiver, attendant, table waiter, taster. Taster. You mean like Nehemiah, a cupbearer? Maybe when he tasted of what was in the cup to make sure that the king wasn't poisoned? One who offers food and drink. That's the word used to describe the service that Jesus does or did for those that He was with then and for us now. Describes pretty much what Nehemiah's whole job was, doesn't it? Who did Jesus serve? God. Who else? Us. Who else? Those around Him. Those He didn't know. Those He came in contact with. So on and so forth. What are we trying to be like? Certainly like that. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Excuse me. I had to grunt when I bent over to keep you from hearing me creak. Yeah, I know, Joe. Joe said it gets worse. It's getting worse every day. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5. Yes, that too. We'll go to Philippians. Now that you mention it, I think we'll just change this whole direction we're going and we'll go to Philippians. How about that? Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Have this mind amongst yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. This particular Greek word is the word doulos. Do you know what the difference is between this one and the word that was used in Matthew 20, 28? This one, Joe said this one is servant and slave, and that's correct. This one is bond servant or slave. What is that? And how does that differ from someone who's just an everyday run-of-the-mill servant? By the way, last week, Debbie told me that John Holzer almost had to throw Sue out in the aisle to get me to see him over there, or 2 weeks ago when he's making a point. And I'm really trying hard to work back and forth, so just, if you want to say something, get my attention, air horn, throw it at me, and I apologize ahead of time if I'm not seeing you. What was the question I asked, by the way? This kind of servant, how does that differ? Bond servant, slave. Pardon? A choice. What does a bond servant or a slave not have? A choice. What level of servitude does it indicate to you? They have been purchased. They have been forced. they have, if they don't do what they're bought or purchased or paid for to do, might there be punishment? Jesus is a bondservant? Jesus is a slave? What was his job? Who was he to serve? I mean, he looked at it that way. We've got him identified as both, all kinds of servants. Have we pretty much covered the range as to what kind of servant Jesus was? Identified with the Greek word diakono, identified here with the Greek word doulos. We got any other kind of slaves? Or servants, rather? We pretty much covered it, hadn't we? One who's got to do what his master says do under threat of something. Whether it be death or hard labor or whatever the case might be. That's Jesus. He came, put himself in the form of a bondservant in order to do what he had to do. That we're thankful that he did do. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9. Oh, look, I found Hebrews chapter 2. We may go there next. I was just jumping ahead. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, how? Tell me how Jesus was rich. Pardon? He was God. What's everything? All creation? Pardon? The luxuries of heaven. He sat where? At the right hand of God. It was given to him, was it not? He was rich in that way. Is that how we see richness? How much money do you think was on Jesus' W-2 working in the carpentry shop? What tax bracket do you think he fell in? Pardon? He probably didn't have enough income to pay taxes, did he? Well, I don't know how their system worked, because he did render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. So he did have to pay some tax. But you get the point. In today's market, you might not have made enough. That's not how we see richness, is it? We're going to identify it most times, more often than not, in terms of something monetary or with possessions, the size of the house, the size of the car, the number of cars, the number of boats, whatever. But he was rich. Back to 2 Corinthians 2, 8, 9. Yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty become rich. Now we're contradicting ourselves again, right? What is it? Either you're rich or you're poor. You can't be both. Can you? Or can you? Was there poverty involved here? From the standpoint of Jesus, as he walked as a man on this earth, where did he fit in the socio-economic ladder? Was he a king, an earthly king? Was he a magistrate? Was he a landowner? Did he have a fiefdom? Whatever. Yes, no? Absolutely not. But what riches did he have that no one else had? What riches do we potentially have when we obey the commandments of our God? Well, yeah. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9. Remember why Hebrews was written? Remember who it was written to? That's not a trick question. Remember who wrote it? Didn't I pop off one night that I knew who wrote it and I was going to tell you, but I didn't tell you, and I said, I'll tell you later? Something like that. I was kind of sassy about it too, wasn't I? Yeah. Yeah, well, Paul wrote it. We cannot prove that. No, it's not in there. Yes, I believe Paul wrote it. Okay? For several reasons, we won't get into it. Hebrews chapter 2, it was written to counter, or for the most part, to remind the Jews, the Hebrews, who they were and who Jesus was, and to fight the growing theory of Gnosticism that was prevalent in that particular time. And he started at the beginning, and the writer told them, you got to remember who Jesus was. Okay? This is who Jesus, and he worked his way all the way through, compared him to earthly kings and so on and so forth. Chapter 2, verse 9. But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus. What's lower than the angels? Yes, we are. Who said that? Les did? Yes, we are. Why is that important for Jesus? Who was he? The Son of God. Yet, during a period of approximately, give or take, 3 decades, he was here on this earth. Same flesh as what you and I have, right? And he was what? Made lower than the angels. Yet he was the Son of God. Verse 14. Let me finish verse 9. Namely, Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Verse 14. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil. Verse 17. Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become merciful and a faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. What does a servant do? Is it more than just performing a menial task? If I'm serving someone, Cornelius said that I can be assisting them. Certainly. Am I providing a care to them? If I'm providing a service to them? What about the business that I'm in of home health? And my girls and guys go out and they're caregivers to people. Is that a service? Assistance? Judy, you had a comment? Judy says that when you serve others, you put their desires and needs above your own. Are we good at that, typically? Can we? Does it hurt us to do it? Do we feel like or do we want extra credit? Or what about quid pro quo? All right. I'm going to come bring you a meal because you don't feel well enough to cook it yourself. However, in the future, when I'm down for a couple of days, when I've got a bad case of the shingles and I can't move, I expect you at my house with a bucket of fried chicken. Is that how we look at service? And I do want that extra crispy, Joe. Okay? Sometimes I think perhaps it is. But we've got to be the lowest of the low. And if we're going to serve, I guess the major point to drive home of this particular class tonight is that if we're going to be a servant, We've got to get used to the fact that we're on the bottom rung of the ladder. Period. End of story. All of us. Old, young, male, female. If we're going to serve someone, we're going to be at the bottom. And then we're going to be blessed because we're at the bottom and have taken that position. Galatians chapter 3. How many of us complain about our pay? Who makes enough money? Give me a show of hands. What? Huh?
I said, not Donald Trump.
Well, oh, you're not Donald Trump?
No, he doesn't make enough money.
Oh, okay. Novell's comparing himself to Donald Trump. I'm not sure what that's all about. Ask him later. I think I misheard something, perhaps. We're not, how much money are we going to make being of service to someone? If we look at it in terms of earthly reward. Is there some positive feeling we get when we've done a service?
Yes.
Certainly there is. Is there going to be something that we're going to be able to take to the bank and go buy that bucket of chicken I was talking about earlier? Probably not. But how many of you have a 401k or some type of savings account or a retirement or just Social Security? There's a retirement plan in service that's going to pay off big time when we get to heaven. We're not going to get much pay, but God has a contributory plan that He's putting on our account, because what's going to be there for us? How many mansions are there in heaven? Yeah. Galatians chapter 3, verse 10. For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all these things written in the book of the law and do them. Is service an option? Is Christian service an option? Well, can you make a choice not to do it?
Yes.
Absolutely. Novell calls a work day. I can make the choice not to show up. Someone needs my help. I can make the choice not to do it. Now, in making that choice not to do whatever it is that I should be doing, who am I saying no to? Novell first, or maybe Novell second, God first. Let me put it that way, I guess. That'd be a better way of putting it, wouldn't it? We all have a choice to make, but when it comes to what God has commanded us to do, is there really a choice? What about the commandments of God? Are they optional? Are they thoughts or ideas? Or are they commandments? It's our Christian duty to serve one another and serve those in the community. And by doing so, serve God. Dirk?
Because God has created us with a free will, we always have a choice. But we always weigh things at risk and reward. In other words, if we choose to do God's will, we have a reward. If we choose not to do God's will, there's a risk that we're going to end up somewhere we don't want to end up. But God gives us that choice. It's not a forced or mandatory thing. You want to be a child of mine, here's the rules. This is what I expect of you. And the cool part is He's made provisions for even when we screw up and don't do it right, we still are forgiven. We have the ability, the choice, to continue to do it again and again.
That was well put, and I hope everyone heard it. If I could sum it down into a couple of words, you have a choice. You always have a choice, but you don't have a choice. You know what I mean? That's what Dirk said. We all have free will. We all have a choice to do or not to do. But if we exercise the choice not to do, then there's a choice that God has that He might exercise also. I mean, we can Work or not work, it's kind of up to us, I guess, in that respect. Why did the Israelites have feasts and holy days, by the way? You know? What was the purpose? What did you do with sins in Old Testament times? There were scapegoats. Yes, there were. There were feasts. There were holy days. What was the point, Day of Atonements? What was the point? What were you doing with all those sins and things that you didn't do that God commanded you to do in those times? Rolling them forward, right? God was taking care of all these things by you doing this particular sacrifice, or you having this particular day, or you doing this particular feast. What'd you do in the year of Jubilee? Remember Jubilee? Kind of started over again, didn't you? Every 50th year, you kept rolling these things forward, and every 50th year, you just kind of wiped them out and started over again. In Galatians 3:10 that we just talked about, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Is that the way that it works in the New Testament, under the new law? Do we have that rolling forward? Stay in Galatians and go to chapter 5, verse 4. We use this scripture a lot. We use it to talk about the subject of falling away from grace. We don't really talk about the nuts and bolts of it a lot of times as to what it's talking about, as to why we are falling away from grace. Chapter 5, verse 4. You are severed from Christ. You who would be justified by the law have fallen away from grace. Are we justified by that old law anymore? It's gone. There's a new covenant, right? New Testament, new covenant, new promise. The old law in the old days was there and justified us, and we went from year to year, feast to feast, year to year to 7 years times 7, and then finally to the 50th year, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, that law was done away with. And ultimately, the new covenant came into place. And ultimately, if we don't do the commands of God, if we don't live in accordance with His Scriptures, where are we according to chapter 5, verse 4? Severed. And that would be the whole point of Christian service. A, we've got to do it willingly. B, it's a commandment. My question to you then is, what motivates you to do Christian service? Do you do it because the elders made up a book and they listed 4,612 jobs in it, and you found the one that you think you can do on alternate Tuesdays in months that end in Y? Is that our attitude about it? If this were a perfect place, how long would that list, how much time would the elders have to spend on that list? There wouldn't be a list. Because as Christians, we would be looking for that job to perform ourselves, would we not? We would be trying to find someone to help. We would be trying to find something to do that let our light shine amongst the community. You know, I've got a whole bunch of scriptures, and I've got not much time. Let me figure out how to end this. If you have zero abilities, raise your hand. No veil. And I was going to respectfully submit to you that if you did raise your hand, you were not being honest with yourself, because God did not create junk. He gave us all something. The parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25 talks about a guy with 5, a guy with 2, and a guy with 1. The guy with 5 apparently had more ability than the guy with 2, who had more ability than the guy with 1, but God didn't give him 0. Got the point? The 5 guy and the 2 guy were commended because they went out and did what? Something. They did something. They worked. The 1 guy sat back and just decided he'd let things be status quo. And it got him in a lot of trouble. Did it not? Conclusion. 1 John chapter 5, verse 3. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments. And His commandments are not burdensome. Is there anything that God has commanded us to do that's going to create stress or distress or be something that we are not capable of doing? Christian service is our responsibility, our commandment, and it ought to be something we want to do, and it ought to be something that brings us joy from the heart. Okay, there's a guy, and he's spent his whole life doing Christian service. And every time he does a good deed, he writes down in one of those blank pages that's at the back of his Bible, took food to the church today for a funeral. Put today's date on it. Right? And then he would write, went and picked up Joe and took him to church today. And he'd write it in his Bible. And he did that, and he had page after page after page after page of things that were in his Bible. So he sat down one night, it was a cold winter evening, and he was sitting in front of a roaring fireplace, and he looked at his Bible, and he started reading all the things he had done over all those years, and he started ripping the pages out and throwing them in the fireplace. And his wife came in, and she said, "Honey, what in the world are you doing?" He says, "I got to thinking about it, and I decided that when I get to heaven, I didn't want to have more things in my good book than God has in His." Why do we serve? All right, next week we'll continue with service.